Hello, I am Pedro Paulo Funari, Professor of the Department of History, University of Campinas, Unicamp, Brazil. I've been working with a rebel state in Brazil, Palmares, in the 17th century, and I will talk about the intricacies and the relationship between this rebel state fighting for freedom in the American continent, including Africans, native Brazilians, and ordinary people in general, so that they shaped the world in the past and may inspire us in the present for a better future. The first thing to stress here is the fact that since the 16th century, the Portuguese colonized Brazil and they established a series of plantations in the coast, sugarcane plantations, so that the people would have the production of sugarcane here in the South American continent, and it would be exported to the foreign market, particularly for the European market. To do that, the Europeans used enslaved people mainly from Africa. For the first decades, since 1650, the Portuguese and the colonizers used native people to work in the plantations, enslaving natives. But they soon introduced African enslaved peoples so that it would improve the productivity of the plantations. So much so that in a few decades, up to the middle 17th century, most of the plantations were worked by enslaved Africans or Creoles, Africans born, people of African descent born in Brazil, born in the Americas. There was also a mix of native Brazilians and Africans as they all shared the common enslavement process. If this was so since the 1560s, at the end of the 16th century, that is to say in the last decade, 1590s, we have the documentation showing that there was a rebellion against this system, people fleeing the coast where there were plantations, going to the hinterland, so that they could form their maroons or their own communities. These communities continued to grow for several decades, particularly during a political period of rivalry between the different European powers. Since the 1580s, the Portuguese colony was part of also the Spanish Empire. It was only one empire, Spanish and Portuguese. So that the rivalries in Europe were transplanted in the Americas. And soon, in the mid-17th century, the Dutch settled there in the northeast of Brazil, the main producing area, so that there was a rivalry between the Portuguese to the south and the Dutch to the north, trying to control the area. This led to a reinforcement of the fleeing peoples. These peoples were struggling to flee from enslavement. This helped to strengthen the Maroon, even though first the Portuguese and then later the Dutch attacked yearly, the settlement. But in any case, they were unsuccessful. They continued this assault for a long time, but they were fighting each other, the Dutch against the Portuguese. Since the 1654, when the Dutch were expelled from the North East of Brazil, the Portuguese and the colonizer in the coast decided to fight more frontally the rebels. But still, for several decades, yearly, they tried to destroy the settlements of the Peru, unsuccessfully. So that in the 1670s, they tried forcefully, but it was only in the last decade of the 17th century that they hired fierce pioneers from the south of the colony, the so-called Paulistas, from the city of São Paulo. These were people of mixed descent. Most of the people were of Indian, native Brazilian females and Portuguese males, so that it was a kind of mixed pioneer population. These were slave raiders, and they were also searching for gold, diamonds, and other drugs of the backlands. So that this force was very strong. They were fierce, harsh. They enslaved people and destroyed people. So this is the reason why finally in the 1690s they were successful in destroying the settlements and then capturing the last king, Zombie, and the settlement was destroyed in 1695. After this, the settlement was continued in use by the local population because it was outside the coast. It was 60 miles from the coast. It was outside of the plantation area. And it would be later on, since the 20th century, that several social movements, native Brazilians, African Brazilians, ordinary people in general, used Palmares as a main symbol of resistance in the struggle for civil rights, for culture, respect, and for heritage protection of the people. So that in the 1970s, there were a lot of movements defending the commemoration of the settlement, the Palmares. In the 1980s, in 1985, when the country returned to civilian rule after a long dictatorship, military civilian dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, so just after the reestablishment of civilian rule, Palmares was declared a national monument so that it was protected. We were able to study the settlement archaeologically. In the early 90s, we established an archaeological project, including myself from Brazil, others from Brazil too, other people, and also Africanists from the UK, Mike Rowlands, a specialist in African issues, African archaeology, and also Charles Orser, a specialist on the African American slavery. So that we were able to study the archaeological material, particularly in relation to several aspects of this pottery used there. The pottery was of African and native Brazilian forms and shapes, but also we found the evidence of ordinary glazed pottery probably produced in the coast by the colonists. All of this showed that the settlement was linked to a global system, capitalist system, uniting the African continent, the American continent, Europe, and even Asia. It's important to stress that the settlement itself was of, we have only information from the colonizers, the Portuguese and the Dutch. In the case of the written documents, they refer to several features of the settlement. But the problem is, or the issue is, the fact that they were outside the settlement, they were foreigners, they were colonizers. They didn't understand the settlement. But in any case, they offer a series of important information. First, the fact that the settlements have names of different origin or etymology, so that most of the names were Bantu languages, of Bantu languages origin, so they were African, from the region of Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, so that we have evidence that probably most of the people came from this area. But we also have native Brazilian names, so that we are sure that there was some kind of mix of population between native Brazilians and African enslaved people. Probably also their descendants, known as Creoles, that is, born in Brazil. This information is very important, for it's an evidence that there was a mix of people there. Then we also have in the documents by the Portuguese and Dutch the information that there were also people persecuted by the religious authorities, people considered as witches or as Judaizers, Jews, crypto Moors, or Muslims, so that we are sure that there was a kind of safe haven. The settlement was a safe haven for all those persecuted by the colonizers. There were several settlements. The main one, it was called Macaco or Mococo. We are not sure. But in any case, this settlement would be in the main protected area in a hill, Belly Hill, Serra da Barriga, or Belly Hill, who has a height of almost 500 meters above sea level. It is protected by the landscape. It is of difficult access. This is the reason why it was the fortified capital. There were also other settlements in a huge area, so that the attacks against the settlers, these rebels, were always through the rivers, going backlands. The destruction of the settlement did not end the story. On the contrary, it proves that Palmares and this mixed settlement, grounded on African influences in the new continent, in Brazil, inspired people since that period, but most particularly in the 20th century, when there was a huge movement for civil rights. Afro-Brazilian, Indian ordinary people, persecuted minorities, persecuted religious minorities, so that it was used, Palmares has been used since then as a major symbol of struggle for peace. Recently, in the early 2010s, in the settlement, was also a heritage and a national heritage, it was established a memorial park so that the people can go there each year to celebrate the 20th November, when the main leader was killed in 1695. This leader was called Zumbi. We don't have a lot of information, but the sources refer to several legends. One legend is that Zumbi was probably trained to be a priest or studied with a priest, so that he was literate, probably knew also Latin, and this was the reason why the Portuguese said that Zumbi, as a leader, as a king, was so powerful. We don't know if this is true, but what is true is that he was able to gather a huge resistance against the domination of the enslavers. And then we must stress also that Zumbi is a term used in Bantu languages to refer to a spirit, a ghost, a kind of strength by the mind. So this was the name, the nickname, let's say, of the king of the settlement. And in the end, it is inspires today up to now. Dangara, his wife, was also considered a hero, and is now taken by feminist movements in Brazil, but also elsewhere, in other continents, in Africa in particular, as an example of the fight for freedom by women. And last but not least, what is interesting about the settlement is this link between Africa, native Brazilians, and ordinary people struggling against destruction, against oppression, for freedom. This continues to inspire us, and we will continue to struggle for a cooperation between Africa, America, the American continent, and the world.